Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much. Well, and from my side, a warm welcome to you all. Again, I'm really delighted to see you come in such numbers to discuss a very topical issue. You know that you yourselves are included in the discussion at the open forum. You will have the opportunity to put your questions during the discussion. Now, over the last few decades, we have seen major challenges arise to the health system in Switzerland, possibly the whole world as well, namely cardiovascular diseases and cancer. Now, that is changing. These were the main challenges, but it's not that these diseases are becoming less urgent, but other diseases are becoming more frequent and more urgent. Today and in the future, the greatest challenges for the healthcare systems will be psychological diseases, which you could call stress-related diseases or exhaustion. Around 5 billion francs in Switzerland are spent a year for stress-related diseases. Now, the Spiegel German magazine had its cover story this week on stress-related disease and summed the whole thing up, saying that an exhausted person is replacing the fragile person. So we've seen the fragile individual over the last few decades. We're now moving on, and we're looking at the exhausted people. So on my right, we have Stephanie Hart, Vice President of Supply Chain and Corporate Services. She's responsible for corporation services there. For 15 or 16 years, she's been active working for Nestlé in various functions. She spent 3 years in Vevey at the headquarters in managing the training and education function. Today, she is here in her capacity as a mother, as a wife, and as a businesswoman. On the far left, Rudi Ozeran, who's a former radio presenter, who you'll know from the Swiss National Radio Channel. He fell ill with depression a few years ago. He wrote a book, started a foundation to deal with these issues. Today, he is a coach for crisis interventions and also has a television program on SF2. Tony Brunemann is Medical Director and Chief Doctor of the private clinic Honig in Switzerland. It's a psychiatric clinic, but not in the conventional format. For example, we don't have any closed, locked areas, and we don't have a classical diagnostic approach to psychiatry rather. So it's not a conventional, traditional psychiatric approach. And he is responsible there for the division of burnout and life crises. Heinz Schüpbach is on my right. He's Director of School of Applied Psychology, University of Applied Sciences in Olten, Switzerland. He's long been responsible in Freiburg, in Breisgau, for working psychology, and one of the focuses of his work is work and health. Welcome to our discussion. Now, Rudi Ozeran, when you meet people who tell you their story, and they ask you about your story, you tell them you suffered from depression, or did you say you suffered from burnout? Well, it's difficult. I'd say that I began with a burnout. That's what it's called when it's related to work. But then it turned into kind of depressive exhaustion. It was easier to talk initially about burnout, but I really have to say that it's a bit of a fraudulent label, because it really is a depression related to exhaustion. The run-up period to that is often called a burnout. But the moderator says, is it easier to get away, is your image better if you say burnout rather than depression? Well, let me give you an example. Quite often at a party, people ask you about what you've published. And if I talk about burnout, then people generally stay in the conversation, they talk with me, they agree with me, they make positive contributions to the conversation. As soon as I mention the word depression, then their eyes go blank and they walk away, and I have to leave the party. So I can see the huge difference there. Mr. Brugman, what is the difference between a depression and burnout? Is there one? Well, yes, there is a difference. I think there are prior stages, the initial stages, which would be called burnout rather than exhaustion-related depression. It's a process where exhaustion begins, but depression hasn't set in. But when it becomes clinically relevant, where somebody is in a condition where they can't really work in the way that they have done in the past, then yes, it becomes an exhaustion-related depression. So I think there is a point where you stop saying burnout and you start saying depression. So what you're saying is it's some kind of continuum that begins with burnout and moves on to depression. Well, yes, I think if you're speaking exactly, truly, not every burnout results in depression. That's a typical development, but there are burnouts which can lead to anxiety or psychosomatic diseases. So if you want to put it concisely, you could say that burnout is, first and foremost, exhaustion-related depression. Stephanie Hart, you have a very busy life as a wife, as a mother, as a leading businesswoman in a major company. Have you ever reached a point where you've said, oh, I can't take it anymore, it's too much, I have to be careful to ensure that I don't fall into a burnout?
I can definitely say as a mother and as a professional and as a wife, you try to be all things to all people. And sometimes you start to forget about yourself. And so I've never fully reached that point, but I will say I do make sure that I do make time for myself. I think looking at proper time management and not only caring for everyone around you at work, at home, but also taking a moment for yourself allows you to have that quote-unquote sanity check to actually prevent the burnout, or what I often really refer to as exhaustion. But with two small children, exhaustion is sometimes inevitable.
Well, other people in your position will perhaps say, or would burn out. How is it that you avoid that? What characteristics, strengths do you have that enable you to carry the burdens that you have and enjoy yourself?
Apologies for the delay. It takes a little while for the translation to come through. When other people ask, how I do it, I think a lot of it has to do with I am from the United States. I have a very strong family support system with my mother and father. I'm the only child. And really, I have a lot of drive, a lot of ambition, like many young women in the room. And I know that I'm capable of doing it. So I think that attitude is half the battle. Believing that you actually can get there and can actually achieve a certain task or a certain goal. But I also think that at times, and I reflect on my time living in Vevey, that sometimes there are cultural challenges that apply more pressure to those types of situations. And that's where you really need a support group of people in your community to give you that additional encouragement as well. So that's really how I tell people that I do it.
Okay. Herr Schüpbach.
Mr. Schüpbach, how come some people fall foul to burnout and other people who have to put up with the same level of stress don't? Well, I think your question to Ms. Hart was very interesting. How is it that you avoid burnout and others don't? It sounds like you're saying there's some kind of personal decision. Oh, no, says the moderator. That's not what I meant, but I'm interested that it sounded like that. What's important for me, and I want to say that right at the outset, is that there isn't this kind of dividing line between burnout and not burnout. That there is a positive element to burnout, which is commitment to work. And I think it's very important that Mrs. Hart has said, I'm really on that positive side. I commit myself to work. I find that work is rewarding, and therefore I commit myself to it. I don't lose myself in it, but that's a positive side of it. We see that in the military, for example, where burnout is possible, and it has a lot to do with your relationship with your work and how easy it is to step back from it. There are a lot of teachers, for example, who get to around 50 years of age and then suffer from exhaustion. Now, if people ask me what burnout is, I would say it's an allergy against one's work and one's workplace. And I think that if you can avoid this allergy, if I can commit positively, then I can really avoid burnout as well. So it's about my relationship with my work, and that relationship can enable me to positively avoid burnout. Then, says the moderator, how come today we have so many people who are suffering from this? It seems to be a very widespread disease. It's an epidemic almost. Well, allow me to come back on what Mr. Schüpbach said. You said that the positive side, commitment and enjoyment of your work, protects you from burnout. I would agree, but this positive commitment also encompasses the fear in today's society that if you are positively committed, then there is the danger that you will accept a greater commitment, greater burdens, because the performance demands are very high, and that positive commitment can ultimately lead to an excessive demand which can tip into burnout. So I think we need to recognize that there's also a danger in excessive positive commitment. Well, for us as a work psychologist, it would be a disaster if we say that people who are passionate about their work are running the risk of burnout. We have to be clear. We're not saying that commitment is the work. There is an English term that we use in Switzerland, commitment to the company. And there's overcommitment as well. People feel that the school or the enterprise is still incredibly important, even when they're fed up to the hind teeth of it. Well, I only come across people who are really committed, and I was really committed as well. Really passionate about my work. So the question is that I have is why do I feel guilty? I don't think this was necessarily what you were saying, but the problem is that people who were very committed suddenly realized that they cannot do the same work that they were doing in the same time, that they can't keep juggling all of their commitments, and at some point they find that they have to escape from the job that is making them unhappy. But it's not a job that they want to change against something else. For me, it was a complete disaster. It was a catastrophe. I loved my job. I didn't want to, at least consciously, maybe I have unconscious motivation, but I certainly consciously didn't want to escape my work. Well, what's tragic in this process of moving from commitment to overcommitment is that frequently it only becomes apparent after burnout. there's no monitoring of what workers are doing. They keep on working harder and harder and harder, and they burn out their resources. And ultimately, the way of seeing the warning signs is that there are physical reactions. Often the body is wiser than the head. And looking back on a burnout, it's possible to see what the warning signals were that were ignored.
I'm actually going to comment particularly from the sorry, I'll wait till everyone gets their headphones. I was going to comment particularly from the work perspective, because I also think that there's a responsibility, be it work or school, to know and understand the people that you're working with. So if you realize that maybe their behavior is starting to change a little bit, they come in, they're looking a little tired, they're getting a little short or curt with their answers. There are different warning signs that we see in the workplace as well, that whereby we can actually provide some possible assistance or guidance to say, is everything okay, or refer them to some type of employee assistance program, not to pry into their personal business, but to offer some assistance. So I think it's very important within the workplace or in the school environment, the education environment, that as a teacher, as a colleague, as a boss, that you understand the people that are working with you, for you, or by you, so you can help them with some of those warning signs.
Also ich glaube, da ist ja
This is also a topic that you've touched upon, Mr. Brühlmann. That is the ability to pay attention to oneself. That's very important. When people lose this feeling or this self-attention, when it's taken away from them, usually we say who is sick stays at home and who is not sick goes to work. That is what we've been saying in the past. And we now see that fewer people are sick. They're all at work. Does this mean that they're in better health? But there's a new phenomenon, and that's not absenteeism, but presenteeism. That's people go to work even though they should be staying at home because they're sick. They're not really feeling very well, and it probably would be better if they stayed at home, even if it is Monday, and be absent. And this protective measure is not taken. And then when people are sick for psychological reasons, then usually it takes a long time until they can go back to work. Once the bow has actually broken because of excessive stress, it'll take a very long time until they can go back to work. It's a matter of weeks and months even. That's very interesting, says the moderator. If we take this into account, what you've just said, Mr. Schüpbach, whose fault is it? Is it everyone's fault? The person who's working too much and is now sick and really should stay at home has assumed too much work? Have they simply not realized that they have too much of a burden? Or is it the job itself? Is it the employer? Is it the fault of the employer who is demanding so much from employees that they cannot afford to stay at home any longer because they cannot meet all these demands that come towards them because of modern-day jobs? Mr. Schüpbach, that's a rather dangerous way of putting the question. Burnout is being seen as an individual's problem. Now, more and more people are talking about organizational burnout. It's not just the individuals who are burned out, but entire organizations are in the process of burning out. And they're also famished, in a way, deprived of fuel, of food. There's this component of energy. There are simply no longer enough resources available, and I think we will have to come back to this aspect of the resources, or burnt out teams. And then, Mrs. Hart, I think it's also impossible for colleagues to support one another because everyone says, I'm totally fed up, I've got too much on my plate, I simply haven't got any leeway to support others. Mr. Josuan? I can only speak from my own experience. I've noticed that you don't have a break-even situation in your energy resources. You cannot sleep anymore. You lose your self-confidence, and you have this fear of failing. And that's why I put my foot even more on the gas pedal to make sure that no one would notice that I wasn't in top form, and the overall result was counterproductive. Now, if I'm a bit self-critical, I would say that the factors such as self-criticism, my perfectionism, were just as much at fault as the external factors. For example, that I had less and less movement leeway to act. So the internal and external factors were just as much at fault. Mr. Bruman, I don't think that one should attribute guilt to the individual or the organization. There's an interaction between the two. Now, even though burnout is used widely in organizations, there's no realization that the individuals are being put under too much stress and burden. But one should concentrate also on the personal aspect in dialogue, in treatment, and it may even reach back a very long time ago, parents demanding too much from their children. You mentioned the word perfectionism. One always has to be best and be perfect, or the overcommitment that one assumes responsibility for absolutely everyone in the vicinity. All these are factors which reinforce stress. These are the multiplier effects, so that stress may lead in one person to burnout and in another person not at all. So one has to become very familiar with these aspects, and one has to understand what one's own contribution to this situation is. The moderator. Many scientists say that it's also genetic. What would you say about that, Mr. Bruman? That you're born to become a burnout patient, to be very simplistic. No, I don't know of any studies. Well, there are psychobiologists in Hamburg who have performed such studies. Well, maybe, says Mr. Bruman, it's not genetic. That's not the appropriate term. You would have to call it constitutional. You are born with a certain constitution, and this may have some part in your personal development. Also, how do I cope with this pressure in modern society, these burdens, the stress? And let's not forget society either, all this social development. If you want to find a culprit, well, let's find such a culprit in society, in social development that has become uncontrolled. We're here at WEF, at the World Economic Forum, and I'm sure that a lot is being discussed on how the extreme economic positions have led to such a situation. Could you be a little more specific, says the moderator? I don't know whether I can be permitted to say something. No, we are here at the open forum, and the stress is on open. Mr. Bruman. Well, today, this topic is burnout the latest fashion? We could also say that financial crisis is a fad. But I think we should take this very seriously. The factors, the economy, influence the social ambiance too much. Performance, money, all these aspects have taken on too much importance. I'm not against performance at all. I think we can have self-realization in performance, but there's simply too much stress on money, profit, and it's not good for us. Stephanie?
Completely agree with the points that were just made as far as the social stresses. If you look at this day and age, the information that's on television, that you read in the paper, there's so much emphasis and so much pressure for people to perform. and the performance levels of 2011 in comparison to performance levels in 1993 are completely different because of technology. We're in a world of texting. People very rarely speak to each other, so texting is the main form of communication, it seems, in teens and in the generation prior to mine. And so with that, there tends to be a lot of pressure that's built up, and there's no real way to release that, and you're trying to comply with what everyone else is doing instead of being focused on what's really best for you.
Aber was können Sie als
If you are here as a businesswoman, a member of the board of your company, so what is the company's responsibility to ensure that the pressure and the stress that does exist in modern-day society is not imposed too much or passed on too much on the employees?
Specifically, I can speak for what we actually do in Nestle, and we do in all the countries. The local markets actually help to regulate some of the policy that we have in place. But in all of the markets, we have employee assistance programs that we can actually refer employees to. We don't mandate it, but it is an outlet for the individual to reach. It's typically not connected with the company. In particular, it's usually a third party, someone like maybe some of the panelists here that some of our employees actually see. So I see that as an organization, we do have a responsibility to provide an outlet, but we may not have, as an organization, the absolute solution, but rather a guide to someone that can potentially provide that individual the right solution.
Herr Schüpbach?
Mr. Schüpbach? I don't think it's a question of attributing guilt to the individual or the company. We're trying to understand the phenomenon. And I think we can understand it better. I also have dealings with companies. We'll understand the phenomenon better if we can understand the individuals better, how the company ticks, how the teams tick. I believe that in many companies and teams, burnout has been kind of incorporated right from the beginning, built in. We talk a lot about performance pressure. Well, this seems to be as if there was someone tracking you minute by minute, telling you have to hurry up, you have to perform better. The very difficult thing about burnout is that this isn't the case at all. The impetus in companies, and Alain Ehrenberg, the social medical expert, describes this very well, is the fact that we are never very satisfied with what we are doing. Everyone tries to do better and higher, faster, and so on and so forth. We have flexible organizations with independent, relatively autonomous teams that are then supposed to perform better, produce better, and dates have to be observed, have to be respected, and it doesn't really matter where you do your work, you can do it at home. So there's this risk, the hazard of flexibility. In the past, I used to go home at 5 o'clock, and if my job wasn't done, that was just too bad. Now it's teams that have to assume the responsibility of keeping deadlines, or whole departments, and it has to be at all cost respected. Well, you're saying that the pressure is there, says Mr. Brühlmann. Yeah, but individuals also impose this pressure on themselves, says Mr. Schüpbach. Mr. Brühlmann. So the pressure is there and ever present in companies. Mr. Josseron, I can see this in my daily experience, and others have spoken to me about this as well. It's very much a taboo. It's not described. There are these negative labels that are attached to the whole phenomenon, and people then say of someone who's got burnout, well, he's not much use any longer. He's suffering from burnout. And I myself have heard that I was considered as a risk factor for the company I was working for, and everything is very much personalized. It's very difficult to describe something that is invisible. When I started having heart disorders, I was able to present ECGs, beautiful graphs, black and white, and that is proof, tangible proof. I was able to say, well, I cannot perform as well as before because of my heart, the difficulties I've got. I cannot concentrate as well any longer. And then you are supposed to produce the right arguments constantly. You have to explain to everyone what's the matter with you, what is bothering you, what your problem is. So in addition to suffering from a disease, you have this additional difficulty you have to cope with, and that's very often the reason why people don't accept help, because they are afraid of stepping across this threshold. Mr. Bruman. Yes, it's this step that has to be taken where you have to realize that you've reached your limits. And that is not something that we are taught in society, that it is okay to accept this or to realize this. And often there's the fear of being seen by your colleagues when you return to work as not being able to bear the share or your share of the work. And there's this fear of failure. Once you've taken that step, once you've understood that you cannot take on anymore, that you've come to the end of the spiral where you cannot put more demands on yourself, because otherwise you're going to collapse. When you understand that the demand is too high, the essential step has been taken. And then when you want to go back to work, you simply have to understand that your self-image is different. You can no longer play the part of the person who can take on all and everything, and this has to be defended very strongly. Your superiors do understand when you return to work that you're not the same person anymore. You can take on work, but not as much as before. That's really important. May I perhaps respond to you, Mr. Josran, says Mr. Schüpbach. You said that as long as you talk about burnout, it's quite interesting, but when you talk about depression, everyone fades away. And I think that's exactly what we're talking about. If someone is suffering from burnout, then you can still say, well, I've had such great demands and I did carry the burden for a very long time. I resisted for a long time. And then the fact to admit failure, that one was not able to continue carrying that burden. So there's this double-faced attitude. Individuals don't have unlimited resources, and they are not an unlimited resource. Many teachers or professors or doctors in hospitals, well, healthcare personnel are subject to burnout very much, seem to understand that such staff see themselves as being of unlimited resource, that they have unlimited resources. They can work for 64 hours a week without ever stopping. And it's very difficult for such individuals to understand that this is not true at all. It's considered as a failure. Sometimes it can be a very valuable insight.
Allow me to recall the title, Burnout, the Latest Fashion, the title of our discussion. I'll just quote from Miriam Meckel, the communications professor who wrote a book about her own burnout, who said, I don't like the name burnout. It's often seen as a proof of performance. A professionally successful person has kind of ticked the box of burnout. Does that? What does it? What's your reaction hearing that? Well, it's outrageous. I mean, that's exactly what many people feel as a kind of insult, because we're talking about whether it's fashionable or not. I relate fashionable with words like trendy or sexy or cool. Burnout isn't sexy and not very manly, if I can speak about it as a man. That's why I took so long to ask for help, because I found it unmanly. What I was more interested in was climbing mountains, or etc. But if I climb a mountain, at least I can tell a story about it. So it's unfortunate that such words are used, that such opinions are out there. Burnout, you can talk about burnout, but those people who really need help, who fall into depression, have life a lot more difficult because the idea is trivialized. Yes, well, I think that trivialization would be very bad. I accept the word burnout. To begin with, I thought, shouldn't we just talk about depression? But I do think that it's a useful term, and it's been accepted. People generally talk about burnout. I don't see that it's inherently negative, but I don't think that it should be seen as some kind of sign of performance. I think that twists the whole interpretation of it. I think that in my experience, it's not uncommon for people to say, I'm quite happy that I had a burnout because it's enabled me to find meaning in my life. The crisis was necessary. Had I not had it, then I would simply been obsessed by my own performance and my work and would have continued going in the wrong direction. I would agree with that completely. It can provide meaning. I've come to a better relationship with myself, a better approach, perhaps, to my life, but I've lost a great deal. I've lost a very interesting, exciting job. That was very painful. I've found other areas of work since, but it's still very painful. Some people I've met have simply withdrawn completely from life because they simply couldn't come to terms with what has happened. I think that it can have a silver lining, but I would say in the acute stage, there certainly doesn't seem to be anything positive about it. But there's an opportunity afterwards to step back from your life, to reflect about what's most important in life. And can I find a category, a definition of myself that is still positive, even if I'm not achieving 100% at work? Well, I'd like to take stock here. What we've said is that the syndrome is so widespread that we can assume that amongst the hundreds of people that we have here today, there are some who have experienced such stress in their life and have come close or have even had a burnout. Let us assume that is the case. And what can people do whose life is approaching such a critical stage to stop entering fully into a burnout? What can a person do to defend against such things happening? Well, the first thing is awareness that it's happening, that you're coming to the end of your resources, of your strength. The second thing is to try to bring balance into your life so that you don't focus only on work, but that you recall that there are other things that are important. Why not have room in my life for hobbies, for things that I enjoy? You have to try and produce that awareness to make the changes that are necessary and think about what has provided meaning in your life so far, what has made you follow the path that you have. And if I think about the future, and if I imagine myself when I'm 80 and look back, what would I regret then? Would I say that my friendships were what I wanted? Was my career what I wanted? I think that self-awareness and reflection can really provide the signposts to meaning in life. Definitely Hart.
I agree. The awareness piece is quite critical, and it's easy for us to talk about it with the section of my colleague on the end. It's a lot easier for us to say that you need to recognize the awareness, but it's a lot harder to do, or it's a lot harder to ask for help, as we've already heard. But essentially, it is knowing yourself and knowing when you reach your limits. I know for me personally, I increased or went and found a trainer at my gym so I could have another outlet for releasing stress. So I'm more calm at work and I'm calm with my children, and it was just another outlet. But you as individuals have to determine what that peak point is. Whether your heart starts racing or you start getting sweats at night or you start losing sleep, and say, maybe if I took a little time to breathe in the air, this beautiful Swiss air that I miss, things could kind of settle down. But just, I agree completely with the awareness piece.
Schüpbach?
Yes, Ms. Schüpbach. I think that there is a scientific term, irritation. In German, it works as well, and it means that when I come home, this is very important for me, if I come home and I can still switch off, then that's a good sign. So in our experience, a key prior stage for burnout is that people cannot switch off. There's a constant rumination. They're constantly thinking about their work. They realize that on Sunday they can't stop thinking about having to go back to work on Monday. So the question that you have to ask yourself is, can I have a positive relationship with my work? Can I step back from it? Or do I have a panic attack every time I think about my work? I think that these are key warning signs. There's a psychological term, emotional regulation. If I have a feeling that something is wrong, if, for example, I notice that the parents of my children, the children themselves, are annoying me, the people I have to take care of are annoying me, irritating me, then there's something wrong there. That's a warning sign, and I have to pay attention to my emotions. I have to, if I don't do that, I constantly have to make an effort to have a positive development to my work. And if I no longer spontaneously, through my emotional response, have a positive relationship with my work, but have to kind of force myself to do it, then that's a warning sign. Recreation is important. If I don't have the chance to recreate myself, then I could be in trouble. Now, if you look back on what happened to you, do you think that with the knowledge that you've now gained from your crisis, that with hindsight you could have found the way out, and how would you have done it? Well, I would have asked for expert help a lot earlier. I would have wanted to talk about the warning signals with somebody who knows about them earlier, and I think that help could really have helped me. Furthermore, I would have not been so resistant to taking medication, which I definitely was. I just wanted to say, you were talking about meaning earlier. Yesterday the panel was talking about faith. What helped me was thinking about my faith, my values, my beliefs. I have a theological background. I asked the question to myself, do I have a God who is there for me, or someone who is has high expectations of me, who's expecting that I always do more? Or am I looking for a God who would say that you are valuable, even if you fail, even if everything doesn't go right, even if not everything is perfect. And maybe with that understanding of God, I could find more peace in life and begin to see things differently. So I think the most positive thing for me from this crisis was that I have discovered my direction in life, the one that suits me, and I didn't have that before. That's fantastic. That's the goal, really. If the burnout helps people to find their own way in life, I think that's excellent. And what you're saying about faith is important. What it's useful for is to realize that it's not just about me, that I'm part of a bigger picture, that there's something transcendental here, and that I'm not just responsible alone for my life. There's a broadening, if you like, of consciousness. There's more than just me and my success and my performance. And a philosophical approach or a religious approach can open up that view of life.
And that was one of the pieces that I neglected to add when you asked me my initial question on how I was able to cope with everything and being a mother, a wife, a business or career professional. And my faith in God and whatever anyone in the room actually practices is also my salvation for getting through some of the days or some of the times that are really rough. And I wanted to also come back on one of the points where we talked about failure. In our society, failure is not something that is easily accepted. And it makes it that much more difficult for people to really fail because it's not accepted. And the fact is, every time we fail, there's something that we learn that allows us to grow and to be better in the future. And, look at not Albert Einstein. Look at the inventor of the light bulb. It took him 10,000 tries, or 9,999 tries. On the 10,000th time, he actually was successful. So there were 9,999 times that he actually failed. And if he didn't actually have all those failures, we wouldn't have all this beautiful light now. So I think as a society as a whole, and I may have the numbers off, but society as a whole, we have to also get to a place where we're comfortable with failure. And it starts even with our children, because we want our children to succeed. We want them to do well. But if we always give them the answers and don't give them the opportunity to fail, they don't know how to grow. So I think there's pros and cons.
Es gibt ja viel Kritik.
There's a lot. The American culture is criticized very heavily, but I've learned something positive from the Americans, especially in sport. I love to watch basketball, American football, ice hockey. And what I've learned from sport is precisely that. It's not a disaster to fall down. You can always get up again. And in our corporate culture, in our managerial culture, it's absolutely important not to fail, not to fall down. You cannot create a company that doesn't work. It would be a terrible disgrace if such a company fails. So we have to find a new way of broaching failure. Is it also failure if I've tried something and it hasn't worked the first time around? I would hope to get a second or even a third chance to try it again. Mr. Schüpbach, and after that I would very much like to go to the floor and ask the audience to put questions or make comments to what has been said, but mainly questions. Mr. Schüpbach. Well, I seem to be taking the counterpoint of what is being said here by the other panelists. If you take a Christian view, I think it's important to understand what work-life balance is. We don't like to talk about it very much because there's also work life. Work is very important in our lives. There's much meaning in work. And it's not just a question of working only to fulfill all these crazy demands and then I go home and then I suddenly find meaning of life when I open the front door. And I don't know whether you've followed this, but a few weeks ago there were some reports on the rector of the Swiss Institute of Technology in Lausanne. He seems to be a workaholic. He works nearly night and day. Now, I'm not saying that he's at risk, but when you look at him, when you see him, you don't get the impression that he is burnt out. So to remain creative at work, to go up completely in work, is probably very much linked also to faith and Christianity. And this really helps me personally. And I had the feeling that he was bursting with energy, Mr. Brüland. Well, you're not a counterpoint. I think for all of us, work is important. It allows us to realize ourselves, to develop, to find achievement. It's just a question of how we resist the pressure that is constantly being put on us. And the point where we say, no, I don't want to accept this additional burden or pressure. I certainly don't want to see work as something diabolical. Yes, performance and being committed is very positive. It's not at all negative. But I just put the following question. I haven't found an answer to it yet, but you have given me a part answer to it. I guess that every person has a certain credit, a certain resource, and a certain amount of energy. Anyone who has an awful lot of energy is very impressive, and I admire such people, but I'm different. And everyone must accept the fact that they can and may be different. So demands may be placed on me, and this is very helpful for me to make progress, but we should not overstep what is possible. We cannot compare ourselves with everyone. Everyone has a certain volume of resource, and not everyone can take on the same job. I think a lot of people slip into burnout or depression because they have accepted a job that does not suit them. Mr. Brüland, well, very often it's a question of powerlessness. How powerless do I feel because of the amount of work I'm supposed to accomplish, and how can I control this? All sorts of studies have also investigated the issue of stress resistance. People who can resist stress have a lot of confidence in being able to manage and cope with the situation. Even if I work from morning to night, I find meaning in it, and I can control and manage it. And if there's such a positive confidence in the situation, then I think it's probably easier for someone like that to work 14 hours a day. Very well, says the moderator. Now back to the audience. You can put your questions. Please ask for the microphone. They will be handed to you. The gentleman here at the front. Is there a microphone for the gentleman here?
Der zweiten Reihe.
The second row. Christoph de Haan from Thalwil, and I'd like to put a question to Mr. Schüpbach. There's management by objectives, which is a method which is becoming more and more widespread. And the employee discusses with his boss about the objectives, either annual objectives or other time frames. To what extent is there a danger that the employee will accept objectives that are too demanding, too stressful, and will not be able to meet up to these demands and then suffer from burnout? Thank you for that question. We are also researching this issue. I'm sure Stephanie Hart will agree with me when you make the distinction between goals and objectives. Objectives are givens. Management by objectives is as follows. You have a turnout, an annual turnout that has to be achieved by the team or the department, no matter how you do it. You work at home, home office, e-working. You have to achieve this. Now, it depends on whether such objectives are realistic or not. You were saying that the employees discuss these objectives or targets with the boss. Then they'd be goals, not objectives. And this is a big distinction, whether these are objectives or goals which are agreed with the boss or not, and whether you feel persecuted by these goals. It's easier to achieve a goal than an objective. That's very important. If it's a good process of agreeing about goals and targets, and people have to also know exactly how much they can assume, what can be demanded from them. And it happens often that a team will say, no, I'm sorry, the deadline is too short, or the turnover seems to be too high. But when these goals are realistic, then it's fine. But management by objective, a certain turnover is achieved, and then the following year it has to be plus 5%, so the following year another plus 5%, so you end up as being a completely pressed lemon with no juice left. Another question here at the back of the hall. You may have read in the media recently that a big Swiss company asks, a big company, a Swiss company, has decided that 10% of its employees are not deemed satisfactory. Now, they were hired originally as good employees with good performance, and don't you think that this 10% is going to run the risk of burnout, Mr. Brühlmann? Well, I don't know whether they'd have to go to a clinic right away, but certainly psychologically speaking, it's not very good to be classified in this 10%, so you have to learn how to deal with it. It's difficult to be put in a category where everyone knows that you've been labeled unsatisfactory. The moderator, Mr. Schüpbach, as a work psychologist, you work for a big company that starts with U and ends with S. What's your reaction, your response to this comment? Yes, it's very delicate. It is a statistical basic attitude. And we could say that usually the average is mediocrity, and then there are those who can perform like the elite, but unsatisfactory results. That's the average. I'd like to introduce another term here, or concept, the gratification crisis, or the effort-reward balance. As to say, you expend a lot of energy and you don't get sufficient reward for it. When I taught in Freiburg, means that no news is good news. That is to say, if you don't complain, then it's like praise. And my daughter is studying at university, and the professor came into the auditorium and said, what, 700 students here? That's an awful lot. Anyway, in half a year's time, there'll only be half of you left. And that's not very, very encouraging either. In our society, we assume that normal people are able to work. We're talking about normal people, ordinary people, and these ordinary people are offered a job that they can cope with. That is the norm. But if we look at things from the individual point of view and see the individual strong points and not just the averages, then this is objective and economically very objective, but psychologically it's not very fortunate, and it won't help improve the individual's performance, because we all know how great it is to get recognition and praise if there is the appropriate reward for the effort that I've made. How much of a stimulus that is. But then, of course, we should not be driven to excessive commitment, on the other hand.
Good. Weitere.
Very well. further questions? The lady there at the back.
Well, I'm going to speak in English. I'm Denise Ramos from Brazil. And what I would like to comment is that usually our schools don't teach anything about psychology, how to know yourselves. So my question is how to raise our children to be more resilient to stress.
I didn't quite hear the question, says the moderator. If anyone on the panel did and would have a reply, please.
I don't know if I have the appropriate answer. But the question is there any advice or any information that we can give to children as they're being raised to help them prepare or channel their stress? Is that correct?
Yes.
For the most? To be more resilient to stress.
Yeah. Okay.
So if I can say one thing. You know, one of the things, I have a 9-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old son. And it's quite interesting, the pressures of school, even at 9, you know, to perform and, you know, to make sure all the homework and the tasks are done, as well as playing or doing gymnastics. And one of the tools that I find personally that really helps with my daughter, I was in my room one day, and I had some kind of aromatherapy, like a scent, and I had a long day, so I was smelling the scent. I was waving a wand around the room, and she walked in, and she said, "Mommy, what are you doing?" And I said, I'm trying to relax myself. And she said, "Oh." So she now gets a little scent in her room, and she goes around, and it's just a distraction, really. So I would say, although we don't teach anything formal in the education, I know that we don't in America, I think it's important, and maybe the panelists that are more professionals in this area can add more, but if you provide children with a different outlet so that they can release that stress, I think that's very helpful. Maybe it's you know, kind of an aromatherapy, maybe it's a sport or some type of activity, but something to help them release and cope, and also that allows them to recognize when they get to those levels, because we all know our children when they start to get a little, well, most of us have all of us have 2 children on the panel. We know when they start to get at one another that the stress levels start to go up. So you usually separate them and have them focus on different activities to help channel some of that stress. And then they come back, and as brother and sister or as siblings, they hug and love and play, and everything's fine. So.
Also ich würde dem sehr zustimmen.
Yes, I'd agree very much with what you've just said, and perhaps I could add something to that. In the case of many of our burnout patients, when they think back to their childhood and youth or adolescence, they always come up with this comment, I wasn't ever good enough. Or to turn it around, you need self-confidence to be able to resist to stress, enough confidence to cope with everything, cope with one's life. And this has to be taught or conveyed to children very early on, this self-confidence, so that they can understand that even if they don't do very well, it's not a disaster. Something has to be conveyed by the parents to the children to strengthen their children's self-confidence. Very difficult to add anything to that, says Mr. Schüpbach. And I think anything we say may be wrong. Well, I think what the 2 have said so far is pretty good, says the moderator. We have this term of stress hardiness and stress resilience. Studies on this have shown that after the war, when life was still very stressful, members of certain families were more successful than others, and the question is, how did this happen? I'm not saying that our children have to experience war, but stress hardiness and resilience can only be trained in situations of stress. So the question is, should we expose our children to stress so that they can understand, so that they can learn how to be resilient to it? It's a very difficult question. Any further questions?
Der Herr da vorne kommt gleich, weil die
Gentleman at the front will be next, but first of all, this chap at the back. Mark Lucer is my name. I live in Zurich, where I work and go out into nature to relax. Burnout's come up in my working environment. I think that there are two things to say. That there are people who've had a burnout and they overestimated their capacities, I think. They didn't recognize their own weaknesses. And the second thing is that they weren't very good at self-management. Maybe I'd put that question to Mr. Schüpbach. Would that not be a successful approach for a company to coach people in this area to know themselves better and to be able to manage themselves? Self-management is definitely a key skill which both individuals and teams need to learn. But I would say, once again, self-management needs to encompass resource management, and if you don't have resources, then there isn't that much to manage. So I think if we're talking about objectives, it's very important to have a kind of audit. What are the stress factors? What are the possible resources that we have in the company, social resources, to balance those stress factors? Self-management, for example, could involve mutual support at work. What's the point of self-management if everybody then has to say, I would love to help you, but I've got too much on my plate, so I can't. So it's very important for self-management to encompass resource management, not just one's own resources, but the resources that are available in the team, in management. That's very important, and also to see one's co-workers and company as resources as well. So I think for what you said about the individual approach is absolutely right. You need to know your weaknesses and your limits. You have to know them. Yes, just one point on self-knowledge. I think in this lovely mountain air, it's very easy to talk about, and I can only agree. But in reality, things are different. If someone finds out they have certain limits, but at the same time they're competing for something, if they then get existential angst, they would have to drop out. That's not what people do. They don't do it because they're scared. So they carry this fear until they simply can't cope any longer. If I had been able to recognize the warning signals beforehand, if someone had pointed out the warning signals to me beforehand, then maybe I would have saved myself this crisis and would have become more modest, more wiser. I would support Mr. Schüpbach. The idea of self-management is a burnout risk factor. You need to be careful that you don't fall into thoughts of, it's my fault, all I have to do is manage myself better if I want things to improve. Because then you lose that contact with the solidarity of others and resources. I think management should enable me not just to manage myself, but to get the assistance from elsewhere, resources from elsewhere. Yes, that can be a part of self-management. All you need to do is not understand self-management in a purely individualistic way. Quite often an individualistic approach can only be strengthened, exacerbated by this idea of self-management. Yes, sir, you have the floor. My name is Mitska. A question to you, Mr. Brühlmann. Are there particularly typical forms of conduct amongst the people who end up with you? Well, quite often we see that that what had failed was the team spirit in the company. Quite often team spirit had disappeared, that there was conflict, that there wasn't dialogue, that there wasn't a capacity to communicate. Now that's from the perspective of the person who has experienced a burnout, but I do think that good team spirit, clear communication, a participative management style is certainly something which is far better than its opposite. Does that answer your question? What about management style? Well, I think that managers need to be communicative, recognize the successes, but also give criticism, give good feedback, a kind of openness which combines a sense of team spirit with a feeling of leadership. So it needs to be open and participative, but not leaderless. There needs to be some kind of clear leadership and direction. Good, thank you very much. Any other questions? The gentleman there in the middle, the microphone is on its way to you. Burnout seems to be a positive aspect or positive term for the disease, for the problem, depression, a negative one. I think disease is not just an individual issue, it's a social issue. We're getting older people are healthier than they used to be, but nobody wants to be sick. Is depression a kind of social phenomenon where the society needs to consider its issues rather than just individuals? Well, you can say not only burnout, you can say depression is a fashionable disease. The cases are increasing. And as you said at the outset, the psychological and depressive diseases are really turning into the most prevalent diseases in our societies. So the social development certainly needs to be looked at from the social perspective. Mr. Schüpbach talked about the position of those who are exhausted, who require themselves to perform, who need recognition, and who get into a kind of cycle of increasing exhaustion. I constantly feel the necessity to please others, to be perceived as good, and so there's a kind of lack of values, of a clear identity. There's a constant redefinition of oneself, and that leads into a cycle of exhaustion. And that often results in depression. The other thing which you addressed, and I'd like to pick up on, was the relationship with depression or burnout in our society, which has changed. It wasn't always a disease. It wasn't always accepted as a disease or as a form of suffering. It's kind of as a balance of I have to be good, I have to perform, I have to get more money. There seems to be a contrast with I need to accept and I suffer. In today's lifestyle society, it seems to be that there's the attitude of all you need to do is go to the gym, adopt the right diet, then you won't suffer. Suffering is a part of human life, and I think that that is something that this society loses sight of. Can I ask you just a closing question to you, Mr. Brühlmann, on the question of fashionable diseases? It's not just fashionable. There's a view that not only psychological diseases are increasing, but the way in which we talk about them is changing. 20 years ago, people would go to the doctors and say, my back's hurting, I'm not feeling too good, can I just stay at home for 2 years, and then for 2 weeks rather, and then they would be allowed to stay at home. They'd get around the fact that their spirits were low. Whereas now it's possible to go to the doctor and say, I just can't go on anymore, I'm done. Hasn't a taboo been eliminated where it's now possible to go and say that you're depressed? I wouldn't say that. I think that step, as Mr. Josran has said, is a very difficult one. The step is a very difficult one. The acceptance is a very difficult one. Today, it's more common for the body to give warning signals. And so most people go to their general practitioner, their doctor, with physical symptoms. The fact that burnout does have a kind of positive ring to it means that people can perhaps go to the doctors and say, I'm suffering from burnout. That's quite common. But it's very unusual to say for people, I simply can't take things anymore psychologically, and therefore I need to go to the doctors. Yes, I'll come to you in a minute. There's somebody right at the back. I see an orange sleeve being raised. The microphone is on its way to you. It's a lady. Sorry, I thought you were a gentleman. And you're right at the back. Yes. Beate Kupny is my name. I worked on ships for many years, and although we only had seasonal contracts, there were many cases of burnout. Now, maybe it was I noticed that quite often the people who'd suffered from burnout would disappear, would perhaps come back in the next season, but then they would disappear completely. So this fashionable term, burnout, might have as a consequence that people move from job to job.
Also weil man dann sozusagen nicht mehr bei der gleichen...
So what you're saying is if people leave a company or a job because of burnout, then they have to go on to a new job. And yes, that's what I've seen. The company hasn't reintegrated the people who've suffered from burnout. Eventually, they disappear from the company, and then obviously they have to go and get something else on that basis. And that leads me to ask the question, it's about people's security in their life and their sense of continuity and safety, because they have to go from job to job to get money. Well, Mr. Schüpbach, one answer that's possible is, what about teachers who take earlier retirement because of burnout or depression? Do they stay that way until the end of their days? I know a number of cases of burnout in the teaching profession who really don't have such a bad time when they enter early retirement. But if you were to say to them, things are going better for you, could you not imagine going back to a school and teaching again? You can see how that idea has an effect on them, that they show the symptoms of the allergy that I was talking about. They simply can't imagine doing something that would be so stressful for them. So, unlike depression, perhaps, but I'm on thin ice here, burnout is very specific. I burn out in relation to a specific activity. Once I leave that activity, then it's very difficult to go back to it. It's kind of once bitten, twice shy, but it's possible to go on into other areas. I only have 2 years experience with coaching and supporting people with depression and burnout. Every week I come across a new case. I've only come across one case who's managed to come back to the same job with the same people in the same workplace. One out of all of the cases. Again, it's not scientific. I've only been working for 2 years. No, what I'm saying isn't scientific either, but that's not our experience. I would say that the majority of burnout patients who come to our clinic go back to the same job. In terms of how long they can then stay in that job, I don't know from my own experience, but our therapeutic goal is to get people, when we can, back to the same job, and then using coaching and other measures, and above all, with the change of their attitude towards themselves, to go back to the same job.
That actually goes back to a point that was made earlier, in that we're all different, and there's no one-size-fits-all practice. So the people that the young lady had interacted or experienced with, maybe one set of individuals, but maybe if there were 3 other individuals that left for burnout, they might actually come back, because all of our bodies are, we just respond to quote-unquote therapy or different situations in different ways. So it just shows the uniqueness of us as human beings.
Ja, und manchmal wird die Stelle.
Well, if you're away for 2 weeks, it's quite often it's not possible to come back to a job afterwards. It would be nice. I'd like to hear from you, Ms. Hart. In Nestle, I'm sure there are people who suffer burnout, who leave the company or go for a short while. How do you deal with them?
You mean how do we deal with them actually leaving the company, or do we actually provide a...
Ja.
I think I understand.
Was machen Sie mit den...
Well, what do you do with people in your company who suffer burnout?
Und die vielleicht wieder zurückkommen wollen?
And then perhaps want to come back?
Well, the objective, and I know I keep linking back to our employee assistance program, but it does really link back to either a program that they've gone to that the company has provided, or their own personal physician that they've sought after. But the objective is to provide them an environment in which they can perform their duties and tasks, and not to dramatically change everything about the environment, but to make those changes that can allow that person to do what they were once capable of doing. But that we are not always successful. I can't say that we will always be successful in that task, because sometimes individuals just realize that maybe they're in the wrong job, and there's something else that they really have a passion for, and this was that sign that they received that gave them that guidance to say, I need to go out and try something different.
So, the gentleman here with the microphone. I'd like to address the issue of burnout and exhaustion-related depression again. I think it's a great disadvantage if we term these phenomena diseases. You are a victim of a disease. If you see these phenomena as a signal of change, then it's easier to find a way out. It's more of an alarm which tells me that I have to change something, either internally or externally. Mr. Userin, yes? Yes, absolutely. I agree absolutely 100% with what you've said. But it is a disease. It can become a disease. But you're spot on. It can be a sign, but depression is a disease. But if you say it's a disease, then you can say I'm a victim and someone needs to come and help me. I understand from what the man who asked the question is saying that if it's not labelled a disease, then, well, if I can't sleep for 3 weeks, then I need medical help. But maybe I'm an exception. Well, allow me to touch upon something that we haven't addressed yet, which is interesting, which is that of doping in the workplace. We all get a little tired in the workplace, have a coffee or something. What's interesting is the dividing line. If I listen to what you say, it reminds me that there are people today who get themselves prescribed medicine to push themselves. Ritalin, particularly for men who want to push themselves, women particularly to improve their moods. Prozac in the United States. I've seen figures of that recently. Not only in the United States, says the moderator. Well, things have moved on a lot more in the United States, and those issues are being discussed there. We're not really discussing it in Switzerland at the moment. What you have to recognize is that many people know that they say, yeah, if I have an exam, I can always resort to some kind of medication. And as long as it's on individual occasions, then it's all right. If my daughter Mannheim says, I'm going to take something for this, then you can say, okay, well, just on this occasion, but that has to be all. But there are people who use it systematically, so that they are in almost a constant state of altered mood in the workplace. I have a different definition of illness or disease from you. I don't think that disease for me means that one is a passive victim. If we're talking about burnout or depression, it can depend very much on one's own individual efforts to leave that situation behind oneself. But the element of seeing it as an warning signal and working on oneself, even if you see it as an illness, is part of the whole approach. In the Spiegel, it said that American universities are thinking about carrying out doping tests before exams because so many students are taking kind of medications and drugs, so they have an unfair advantage against other students. So that's interesting to note. A gentleman over there who's had his hand up for a long time. The microphone's coming to you. Thomas Grundmann is my name. Just a comment on the rate curving, the rate curving, the 10% that you fall into if you don't perform well. I think it's good, basically, because it enables a possibility for a conversation to take place in the company so that the management can discuss whether these workers aren't up to scratch, whether they're not performing well enough. So the question is, perhaps, what situations have you been in where there has been a discussion where the boss has had discussions with you about goals or objectives or whatever, and are there research which is carried out as to where burnout really tends to emerge? Is it in big companies or small companies? Well, I can't speak about the first part about my own work because of legal grounds. That's a mutual agreement. It wasn't so long ago. Well, if you've got a legal agreement about it, then it can't have. There must have been something wrong. Yes. Well, I certainly don't want to go into that now. So you're legally prevented from saying anything, Mr. Schüpbach. Well, burnout is common in social jobs. It's teachers or social workers, medical staff have often forget to take care of themselves, and I feel that they need to be ready to sacrifice themselves for their students or patients or whatever. So it was very specific to that sector initially, but I think the definition of a burnt-out organism is something which is now present in all industries, companies, professions. I think it occurs in companies where performance requirements are very high. It's in those companies where there is a clear definition of goals without supporting resources. There's a kind of bet in these organizations which says that we'll give you the freedom to work. If you can do the work that we want you to do in 6 or 7 hours, then fine. If you don't manage to do it, then bad luck for you, and you have to work longer. And those are the organizations which tend to severely criticize their workers. So we have this indirect management, this kind of indirect management of enterprises who establish their objectives with clear stipulations of what they want people to do, and then have a kind of pressure on people to achieve those by themselves without much assistance. Any further contribution?
You had asked about a contrast between a large company and a small company, and I don't think there's really any difference when it comes to a large company or small company. It's just making sure that when you are doing that smart objective setting, and I say smart because they should be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. So you should be able to achieve them in a specific period of time. So if you're working under that foundation, and a good manager and an even better leader would be having a regular conversation, so that at the end of the performance review period, there shouldn't be any surprise for the individual to know that he or she is not performing up to standard. There should be discussions that are taking place throughout that process, which is what we actually do within the Nestle system.
Good.
Very well, says the moderator. I would like to conclude this discussion with 3 comments. The burnout, the latest fashion, question mark, the title of this discussion here. I think it's quite clear that it is a fashion because it's very frequent, will probably become more frequent in the future, but it's not really a fashion. You don't pick and choose and say, oh, I'm going to go for burnout so that I can rest a little bit or chill out. I was very struck by something you said, Mr. Yasura. Failure is not the problem. It's not being able to pick yourself up again that is the problem. And you, Mr. Brühlmann, have sent me a text, and I picked out a very nice article. One should indulge in useless activities instead of always be compulsive about achieving something. I think that is something you can take away with you at the end of this discussion. Thank you very much.